So the last romantic poet in the collection that is studied for edXL is John Keats. It used to be Emily Bronte, and if you're using the PowerPoint that you can see on screen now that's on Teams, you will notice it's called Keats and Bronte, and there's a number of Bronte slides towards the end. Basically, it just broke my little heart to take them all out, so they're still on there. So be aware we don't study Bronte. It's a shame. I did really enjoy those Bronte poems, but just be aware that they're not there anymore. I wanted to give a quick overview really of Keats's life and a bit of background contextual information on him. I think that really helps understand the poems that little bit better. So in this video I'm going to be looking at a poem by Keats, which again is not one of the ones that we will study, so it is not one that is going to come up on the exam, but I think gives a really nice bit of insight into his life. And the poem is, as you'll see on the left there, on first looking into Chapman's Homer. That's how I've started with Keats in the past. I find it a really interesting kind of intro to Keats as a poet. It won't be one that comes up. It's not one you need to write about. It's only a very short one, but I think it's very interesting to kind of get to grips with him. So the first thing I'll do is show that video. If you've got the PowerPoint in front of you on Teams, please watch that. It gives you a nice intro to Keats's life. Very sad life, very short life, and a very unappreciated life actually. Really sort of tragic. Keats was known as was part of what was known as the Cockney School. In other words, he was seen as being less kind of well educated, a bit almost like lower class, or a bit more lowbrow than some of the other romantic poets. And it really upset him actually that Wordsworth didn't, Wordsworth spoke quite disparagingly about his poetry, and that really bothered Keats. So it was a real sort of sad, unfulfilled life. He died very young after nursing his own brother. The woman he loved, he couldn't marry, Fanny Brawne, because he couldn't basically provide for her. Nobody really appreciates his poetry in his lifetime. And you'll see sort of top right, you see on Keats's gravestone, right at the bottom, it says, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." It's bittersweet, that one. A lot of people sort of talk about the fact that Keats is essentially making a comment that he'll die and just be completely forgotten, in the way that if you write something in water, it will just disappear. I think you could argue that. I think there's perhaps a slightly more positive view, which is where Keats's poetry becomes more interesting, which is that perhaps he starts to accept the transience of life. He was very very familiar with death. A lot of his family members had died of TB, and that's what killed him quite young. And I sort of see his poetry as a bit of a journey towards becoming okay with that, and okay with the transience of life, and accepting that actually life is so beautiful because it's short, in the way that Byron kind of argues that in Lines Inscribed on a Cup formed from a skull. So when we get towards some of the later Keats poems, particularly Sonnet on the Sea, a poem all about water, I think you could argue that point about his name being written in water perhaps becomes a bit more ironic, and it is perhaps a little bit more positive. So Keats fits in with the Romantics. I always see Shelley as kind of the second generation answer to Blake, and I see Keats as the second generation answer to Wordsworth. Very much interested in nature, maybe less obviously about pantheism. It's more about nature being linked to time, really, the fact that nature is sort of eternal and nature has been there forever. And yet, ironically, it also lives and dies, and so Keats often muses on the way that shows how his life is transient, but also it shows that his life is transient because nature is always changing, but also shows his life transient because it's always been there, and his life is kind of very, very short. He does have this sense of death hanging over his poetry. He seems to be really fascinated with it. I think partly as he's there because he dies young. His brother died young, but there's also a deeper point. I think that nature, that life is transitory, and is over before it should be. He is deeply in love with Fanny Brawne. That is broken off, and that's part of this wider frustration that I think he has, that he doesn't achieve much. He's not very well thought of. Like I say, he's labelled disparagingly as part of the Cockney School. He's not thought of in the way that Wordsworth is thought of. So we get some of that sort of navel gazing that we get in Shelley, but perhaps with a little bit more justification, I'd argue here, with Keats. So the poem I want to look at is On First Looking into Chapman's Homer. I will say again, this is not going to come up on the exam for the Romantics. It's not one of the set Keats texts, but I think it gives a fascinating insight into his life, and I think really sets up where he is earlier on. So, the story of this is that Chapman released a translation of Homer's Odyssey, and the Iliad. So, what Keats is saying in this poem is basically that by reading this in translation, I understood those stories, and it did something to me that the original couldn't, because I couldn't understand the original. Now, there's a wider point there that in the top sort of public schools of their day, Greek and Latin would have been taught, and these texts would have been studied in their original. Keats's point is, well, I couldn't read them. I wasn't educated to that point. I didn't have access to that, so I only read these stories when Chapman translated them for me. So there's a real sort of social point, quite similar to Shelley, a point about equality and a point, I guess, about the class system, where he's saying, by reading Chapman's version of Homer, I was given access to this. So it shows him straight away as a bit of an outsider. So he says, much have travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. So he's talking here about his imagination, basically. Through reading Chapman's Homer, he's been into these realms of gold, these goodly states and kingdoms. But I think metaphorically he's also making the point that actually through reading Chapman's translation, he was given access to something that normally isn't for him. It's reserved for a certain class of people that he's not part of. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain. So he's giving information really about these stories, and in some ways quite a simplistic poem. Keats is basically talking about these stories that he's got from the mythology. I guess again the islands could be significant in terms of the water. It seems to be an image that just come up again and again with Keats. But this sense of his horizons have been widened. He's talking about these strange lands, but again metaphorically he's saying my horizons were widened by reading this. I was given access to more things. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Yeah, so I could never have access to this until Chapman said it. Chapman's words, Chapman's voice, Chapman's writing gave me access to this. Then felt I like some watch out of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken. Yeah, this opened my eyes so much that I felt like someone who discovered a new planet. There's a weird sort of romantic feeling here, because obviously that many of the planets were discovered in the era of the Enlightenment, where everything was about learning and the importance of education. And so in a weird way Keats is kind of saying I had an enlightenment, I've been educated by Chapman, which in some way seems totally against what the Romantics stood for, which was kind of going against the Age of Enlightenment, going against studying these classical texts and going more towards the language of the common man. And Keats has got a really interesting angle, because as I guess a common man, what he's saying is, yeah, actually, but I need that education to have access to it. It's all very well these well-born poets saying that, but actually I need that to be put on a level playing field. So we do really see how the movement's moved on. I think by this point Keats is very much a second generation romantic. His view of nature, his view of the world is very different to Wordsworth, who basically says, forget the classics, I want the language of common men. I guess Keats's point is, well, it's easy to say that if you've been able to study the classics. Or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. So at the end he compares himself to Cortez. Cortez was one of the first conquistadors who went over to South America. Keats compares himself to that. That the belief was that El Dorado, the city of gold, was in South America. And Keats is saying, I'm like Cortez, going over the Pacific, going over these wide waters, having access to things, having access to these riches that other people don't have, basically. So like I say, it's not a poem that he studied for the Romantics, but I think it is a fascinating one that is definitely starting to give us a bit of an insight into the key points about Keats. A, the idea that he's got to prove himself. B, the idea that he goes against a lot of the ideas of the earlier Romantics. Keats is slightly more ambiguous when I think it comes to Enlightenment, because he feels he needs that education. It gives him a level playing field. See the classical references, he uses those throughout the poetry. I think they're the key things to get from them that really give you a bit of an insight into who Keats is. And of course, that poem is absolutely fine to bring in for wider context on Keats as well. So the next videos we'll look at the actual Keats poems that we'll be studying, but hopefully that's given you a bit of an insight to who he was, where he sort of sits in this romantic movement, and why actually he's on a human level, I think he still resonates with people arguably, dare I say, in a way that maybe Coleridge or Wordsworth or Shelley maybe don't quite so much.